Hi, the SI meteorologist Paul Dorian here on Thursday, May 22nd. Well, it's been a while since we've taken a look at solar cycle 24. There are signs that it actually has reached or perhaps even just surpassed its solar maximum phase, and all in all, it was quite unimpressive. This continues to be one of the weakest solar cycles in many, many years, perhaps 100 years or more. The sun is very quiet right now. It actually went through a more active period a couple of months ago, and that very well could have been the solar maximum phase. We'll take a look at that in a moment. But first, let's take a look at the very latest solar image. Very quiet. A couple of sunspot regions out here on this part of the sun. These are, in fact, rotating into the direction that is the line of fire towards the Earth, facing the Earth. So we'll have to keep an eye on these solar sunspots over the next several days or so. Another region out here moving away on towards the backside of the sun. All in all, though, a very quiet look to the sun, and this continues what has been a very weak solar cycle number 24. Well, here's a look at the sunspot numbers for this particular solar cycle and the previous one, solar cycle number 23. And right in this region right here, it's possible that this very well could have been the solar maximum phase for solar cycle 24. A kind of a double maximum period. We had one little spike up in this region back a couple of years ago, and just over the past few months, there's been this spike here. And again, that could very well turn out to be the solar maximum phase for cycle number 24. We'll see in a moment. Much, much weaker than most solar maximums for solar cycles going back to the 1700s. We're already back on a downtrend, and right now we just took a look at the latest solar image. Very quiet period right now with very few in the way of sunspots, and again, a weak cycle, perhaps even the weakest in more than 100 years or so, and it continues a trend. Notice here solar cycle 23 was quite a bit stronger than 24, but that was weaker than the prior one before that, solar cycle 22. In other words, the trend is continuing for increasingly weaker and weaker cycles here, and there are some that are already forecasting the next solar cycle 25 will be even weaker than this current solar cycle number 24. Well, just how weak has this particular solar cycle been? And in fact, if this has actually turned out to be the solar maximum for solar cycle 24, how weak is that maximum compared to prior maximums? This is a chart put together by a NOAA Space Weather Prediction Center employee going back all the way to the middle 1700s with all the solar cycles in recorded history. In other words, all 24 solar cycles on this particular map. And this red line right in this region right here represents the solar cycle 24. The current spike can be seen right in this area right here. And what we're seeing here, what we're looking at, are the months since the solar minimum. And notice how almost all of these lines, which represent all other solar cycles going back to the middle 1700s, other than these few down here, this particular solar cycle featured a maximum with fewer sunspots than almost all the solar cycles going back to the middle 1700s. Again, this particular plot shows the average number of sunspots since the solar minimum for all these cycles going back to about 1755, and indeed, this little spike is very unimpressive in terms of solar maximum compared to all these other cycles going back to the middle 1700s. Indeed, one of the weakest cycles in many, many decades. Well, for one final big picture look at the current solar cycle compared to others going back hundreds of years, here is a chart showing the sunspot numbers, and this is solar cycle 24 right in this region, right in here. And notice that I mentioned a moment ago how it continues a trend for weaker and weaker cycles. This is the trend line right in here. This is solar cycle 22, which peaked around 1990, solar cycle 23, which peaked around 2001 or so, and here we are, solar cycle 24. There are some already predicting that the next solar cycle 25 will be even weaker than the current one. And of course, solar scientists are always looking towards long-term trends like this. We have had long-term weak solar cycle periods that have had big impacts on global temperatures, periods called the Dalton minimum or the Maunder minimum, where for several decades there was a very weak solar cycles with very few sunspots and very little in the way of solar activity that led to cooler than normal global temperatures. And this will continue to be watched for this particular solar cycle and for the months and years to come as we evolve into solar cycle 25. Now, this does not mean that there will be no strong solar storms to worry about. In fact, there are some studies that suggest that most strong solar storms occur during the declining phase of a solar cycle. In other words, after you pass the solar maximum and head towards the next solar minimum, most of the strong solar storms have actually occurred in that time period. So that is where we seem to be entering right now, the second half of the solar cycle 24. So even though it is a weak cycle, one of the weakest in many, many decades, there still certainly can be some strong solar storms to worry about and monitor over the months to come. And we will continue to do that here at the SIWeather.com. That's it for now for Solar Cycle 24 update. I'm meteorologist Paul Dorian.